Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I am the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. I am delighted to be able to be here tonight for the discussion of Find Me. André Aciman, welcome to the Wisconsin Book Festival. We are also joined by Brandon Taylor, author of Real Life. And Brandon, it is delightful to see you again. You're one of the few people I've seen in person this year. Brandon's event for Real Life was the last in-person event that we had for the book festival. So welcome back.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I'd just like to say thank you to Madison Public Library and the Madison Public Library Foundation. Their support for free cultural events has lasted over the whole 8 years that I've been doing this, but over the past 7 months, it has been unwavering, and it is incredible to work for people who realize how special moments like this are, events like this are. So thank you to them and to all of our sponsors who have made this year's Wisconsin Book Festival possible, though as admittedly very, very strange. Um, I just want to mention that events like this come together because of the great work Andre has done. So I will put, there's a link at the bottom of your screen. Please go and buy the book from our book selling partners at Room of One's Own bookstore. Thank you to them as well for doing all of the book sales for all of the events this weekend. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Brandon and Andre. Thank you so much for being here, gentlemen. I'll see you at the end.
See you soon. Hi, Andre. How's it going?
Hello.
So I just want to start by saying that when Connor emailed and asked if I might be in conversation with you, I first had to lie down on my floor and recover from the shock of it. I am here first and foremost as a fan, a super fan, some might say. Your work has been such a guiding light for me, both artistically and creatively, but also personally. Call Me by Your Name was the first book I read with a queer character in it. And yeah, that book changed my life. And so this is, it means a lot to me just on a sort of personal level. And so just needed to get that out there first and foremost. I'm a huge fan. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with André Aciman, I'll read his official bio, and then we'll move on to discussing Find Me, which is the sequel to your acclaimed and much beloved novel, Call Me by Your Name. André Aciman was born in Alexandria, Egypt, in a multi-language household, which you often hear about in his wonderful essays. He is the New York Times bestselling author of Call Me by Your Name, which is now an Academy Award-winning film. Find Me, Out of Egypt, Eight White Nights, False Papers, Alibis, Harvard Square, and Enigma Variations. He's the editor of the Proust Project and teaches comparative literature at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. He lives in Manhattan with his wife. Welcome, Andre.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I suppose the sort of de rigueur question to ask with a novel like Find Me is, what is it like to come back to these characters who you leave in a kind of in-between space at the end of Call Me by Your Name, and then to come back to them not only sort of years later in sort of reality, but you find them in a different place in their own lives. And not only that, but you open Find Me with a character who we know and love from the first novel, but who didn't have much of a, he wasn't the main character. And so we spend the first chunk of this book with Elio's father. So what is it like to come back to those characters and to sort of find your way into that book with a character who wasn't such a huge presence, except in key moments in the first book?
Well, I mean, the father is the person who makes that, which I consider very moving, it's sort of a speech almost to his son about accepting himself and certainly not repressing what he loves and the person he loves and so on. So I first of all, I was very curious to know more about this person. Who is he? How do you come up with a speech like that? And in the back of my mind, there was always the sense that a lot of people felt no father is like that.
Hmm.
In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. Many fathers are like that. And want to be like that. And if they're not, they're encouraged by their sons and daughters to be like that. In other words, to be all accepting. It's not a big deal. You can certainly live with it and give me encouragement. Don't criticize me or don't kick me out. I've run into a couple of Syrian men in different places on this planet who were literally forced to leave their parents' house because the father could not understand that they could be gay. I mean, think of what a horrible thing that is. Kicked out permanently from his homeland and from his home. So
Mm.
I felt that there was something in this man that must be significant. What kind of man comes with a speech like that? And I let it sort of percolate in my mind for quite a few years because I was writing other books. I wanted to write other books, but I was always enamored with the love that Elio and Oliver have for each other. And you don't forget that. You remember it for the rest of your life. And you also find that there's something extremely real about what it is that they feel for each other. It's not just a kind of utopian love, whatever. It is real. And I think a lot of people have written to me and told me it is as real as what they've lived. So I just didn't abandon them, but I just didn't have time for them. I had tried to write something after Call Me by Your Name, just to pick up the thread where I had left it. But it never worked. Or for some reason, I needed to move away and come back. But there is one thing that I have been um, always thinking that people didn't understand Call Me by Your Name. They always think that the two characters are going to separate at the very end for life.
Mm.
That's not how I saw it. And so people get very emotional. And then I say, but why are you emotional? This is a happy ending. And they don't see that. So, of course, how an author sees his own work is one thing, and how the rest of the public sees it is different. And sometimes the author is wrong.
I love, I feel like that's that's so core to so much of your work. Is it's so funny that you say that at the end of Call Me by Your Name, like you were like, well, of course they're not separating for life. I feel like one of your great themes is the separation that is never permanent, like the separation that isn't always going to be a total severing or breaking away. And so it feels in some ways like, there's a kind of melancholy optimism, not only to the end of Call Me by Your Name, but to many of your books, right? Like your great subject is the return. And so it makes total sense to me that you would say at the end of Call Me by Your Name, well, it's not forever, but I feel like the rest of us don't have that belief, the rest of us don't have the sort of the faith that the chasm will close again and that we will be reunited, because I find that in maybe much of contemporary life, we're so fixated on, but I want to be with that person now. I want it now. I want it. And sort of the idea of it happening down the line or further down, like in our futures, like that just seems the future is a country to which we will never enter or something like that. But I love that. So in so much of your work, people are always returning. There is a faith in the return, and there's a sort of grumpy resignation to, well, it won't be like I wanted, and it's not when I want, but I know I'm going to get back there somehow, sometimes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, there is that faith. I mean, because I think, as you said, like the secret optimism. That's what it is. I'm too embarrassed to be an optimist, so I hold myself back. But fundamentally, I am. I don't think that one can afford to be in daily life, but I am. I can't help myself. At the same time, I think that separations and one of the forms and one of the things that I write about the most is this condition of exile. You can be exiled from your home, you can be exiled from the people you love, you can even be exiled from yourself and lead a totally different life than the one you think was the one owed to you. But I also think that people being torn away from something doesn't mean that you're permanently sort of truncated. There is a kind of grafting that comes later. It will come, and I was always hoped that it would come. So return is, in fact, something that most of my characters do, and they begin to do it obsessively. They keep returning. In other words, I keep going back to Italy, literally, unless there's COVID. But I go back at least 3 times a year Why am I going back to Italy all the time? Yeah, I like it, but I like New York too. So what is it about this going back? What am I trying to put together again and again and again? I'll never know and I'll never resolve it, but I like the possibility of doing it. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's this idea of um the idea of I think this line happens in Shadow Cities from False Papers. You say you're always looking for the moment at which remembering becomes recovery. The moment when you kind of, it's like that great scene in the film of Call Me by Your Name when they pulled the statue out of the ocean, and it's not just a sort of, it's no longer a theoretical thing. It's like an embodied, like a human physical object. And I find that memory in much of your work is like that. There's a point at which a character is thinking obsessively about all of these times that they were walking down a particular street or doing a particular thing. And the act of remembering comes to be, it starts to feel almost erotic. There's an erotic charge to the act of remembering. And like, there's a moment at which, like, that erotic charge reaches its highest potential, and there's like a moment of embodied recovery. And I think about this line that occurs again and again in your work when, like, a character is like, if you were to place a phone call to your old number, there's a part of you that always expects yourself to be on the other line, and it's impossible, but you do it anyway. And like, there's something highly potentiated and almost erotic in the act of remembering in so much of your work.
I totally agree. I totally agree. I mean, there are times when you walk past a building and there, I mean, it's in Find Me. You look at the window and there's a light there. Say, oh my God, I'm there as a graduate student, still doing my homework. But of course you're not. And then I've always asked this question to the public, and everybody raises their hand. How many of you have called your old phone number? Why would you call your old phone number if you have a different one now? And they all do. Everybody does, and they all laugh because they know it's ridiculous. But and think of it, we do things like that all the time, where we try to reconnect ourselves to something that feels as if it's lost, but it's not lost. And remembrance is, in fact, remembrance and fantasy are the same thing. It's just that they're as real as real life, but they happen in the past or they happen in the future or in some different dimension. And we live there most of the time, not in the present, not in the here and now. We all claim to, because that's what we should say if we want to be healthy human beings. But in fact, we're constantly drifting elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also in False Papers. You write about being the sort of person who is oriented, yes, toward the sun or toward the sea, but there's also a part of you that is oriented toward the past. And there's a part that can't get away from looking at the past, and how even the idea of pain or ache is like baked into even the etymology of nostalgia, right? Like this idea, and we're always coming back to the pain or the eroticism of memory because it's one of the ways that we know we're alive, or like we are where we say we are. But speaking of that moment in Find Me, when Sami is explaining to Miranda about the past version of him and what he used to get up to in that old apartment building, the fact that she starts to seem very jealous and possessive when he's talking about the women, and she says, by way of almost correcting him, and she's like, well, but now you're here with me. Do you ever think that I'm have and so, like, what is it about that moment in a sort of early infatuation phase when a person starts to think, I finally found this person I was meant to find, and I wasted so much time, and I'm so angry that you weren't there with me then, and now I'm here and I'm happy, but I'm so furious about, the sort of jealousies and fury we feel at those lives we lived, which were the wrong life. I think someone later in Find Me says, like, you lived, isn't it Johann Sebastian Bach who says that to Oliver in the novel? It's
Yes.
like, you lived the wrong life and you almost messed up the one you had to live.
Well, it's basically, it's one of those cruel moments in life when you realize I messed it up, didn't I? And if you say this when you're 25 years old, it's one thing. You hope that you won't make the same mistake. But if you say it when you're 80, that's pretty damning statement to make. So there is a sense that the wrong life is always hovering around us because we want to repair it. It's not just that it was wrong; we want to repair it, and it's something that I think most of my characters anticipate because they live that way. They're not totally fulfilled human beings, but they know that there's a possibility of that and they have to arrange for it. The other thing is that I think that the mistakes, and I look at my own life, I look at the mistakes that I did when I was 12 years old, 14 years old. You want to know something? I still make them today. So you don't learn anything, but that's not possible. You're supposed to have become wiser. You're a writer, you're a teacher, you're supposed to be smarter. You make the same mistake. You find yourself saying the same stupid things to people, hoping that they'll be enchanted, and they're not. They're angry. And so, why is it? Anyway, maybe I'm seeing the wrong shrinks. Maybe that's what it is.
I feel very similarly when I look at my own life. I'm just like, I thought I had this figured out. Like I know what will happen in a sort of intellectual way, that if I do this action, the following things will happen because they have happened before. And yet there's a part of me that always secretly hopes it will be it will be different. And that was one of the, I feel like that is one of the hallmarks of Elio as a character. It was true of him as like a young person. He was a sort of person who had all of this like perception and insight, and so he knew what would happen if he did a certain thing, but he would do it anyway, sort of hoping it would turn out to be good and that it would work, and that Oliver would come to the door if he like gave enough subtle signals.
Yes.
um, and it just like never quite worked out for him until it finally did. And I re-encountering Elio and Find Me, I was like, oh, he's the same kind of sweetly naive young person, where he thinks he's well aware of the pitfalls of embarking upon these human encounters and human interactions, and yet he can't help but to hope that this person will ask him to stay. You know, that moment after he and Michelle sleep together, and he's putting on his clothes to leave, and Michelle's like, well, why are you leaving? And Elio's like, oh, I'm not leaving, I'm just going to the bathroom. And even though he is thinking inside, like, no, I should leave, but he doesn't want me to leave, but I should leave anyway because then he'll tell me to stay. You know, this sort of the same part of him that is constantly hoping it will change and not trusting that it will, but hoping just the same. Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by that quality in his character, the sort of open-hearted but also deeply suspicious side
Well,
of nature.
he's got more experience. That's what I wanted to show. He's got more experience. He knows that if you meet somebody and it works and you're having dinner together, there's only one thing that can happen after dinner. And he's thrown off by the fact that the other one says, take good care, goodbye, thank you very much, this was pleasant. He says, whoa, what happened? And of course he himself is a different character, because the Michelle, who's much older, asks him, do you have any relationships? No, I have nobody. He says, what, how about incidental relations? And he says, I don't do incidentals. With that kind of attitude. And it turns out he does incidentals, because that's exactly what his life has been in Paris.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And then there's all this really great mirroring happening in Find Me. But we were talking a little bit earlier about Miranda and Sami like standing outside of the 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 apartment building, and Miranda getting upset that she wasn't there with him, and they're upset about all the time they've wasted until they found each other. And Elio and Michelle, who've only known each other like 3 days, have a similar moment where after they slept together and after they've come to be close, Elio's like, I really wish we hadn't wasted that Sunday afternoon. Like, why'd you tell me to leave? Like even then he can't help but to sort of trace back over the near recent history of their short relationship.
And he should have let it go. Okay, but it worked out in the end. Of course, that's what a practical person will tell you. The
Mhm.
other person, the kind of person that I think I am and that Elio is and all my characters are, man, we lost that opportunity, but we're living it now. The amazing thing is that Michel is such a wonderful character, and he says to Elio, "I know that where your heart is," and of course it's clear that they're in love with each other. But he says, "I know I can't keep you, but I would like to have you for another 2, 3 months. Then you're going to go on your major tour in the United States, and I want you to play this." for me, that piece of music that is the whole story of that chapter.
Yeah, I mean, that middle, I guess maybe it's not the middle section, but the section in which we spend all this huge chunk of time with Elio and follow him and Michelle and their relationship. A friend of mine and I read the book to get more or less at the same time. I received two galleys and I put one immediately in the mail and sent it to him.
Oh,
Um, so that he could read it along with me. And we both agree that it's like maybe the best André Aciman has ever written. Like it felt like living in a really good French film. Like it had all the hallmarks of a great French film. First, it's got this great like country house. It's got cold weather, it's got bicycles. They do this really sweet thing of like walking each other through the cold and Elio's pushing his bike. It's got great writing about food and sex and love and intimacy and melancholy and despair. And it just felt like a really great French movie. But the other thing that I love about that section is that it kind of becomes a bit of a mystery, right? Like the sort of mystery of the music. And I'm obsessed with this section. So how did this come to you? This idea of the music tucked inside of the music, the sort of encoded message that these people have left each other, that like Ariel left Michel's father, and that Michel's father left him, and that eventually Michel gives to Elio. Like the music, the sort of intricate puzzle of it all. How did you arrive at that? And then how did you go about writing it so that it didn't feel just like this prosaic thing dropped in the middle of in the middle of this otherwise very intimate and moving novel? Because it just fits so perfectly.
well, it's amazing because as and you know this yourself, when you're writing something, you have an idea and you want to elaborate it because it's the idea that really is sort of germinating.
Mm,
And so you try to create a little plot around it so that it will have a house, a home for that idea. And then you find that I like the house, I like the home, I like the garden, I like the street that leads to the house. And you find yourself expanding. I wanted to write something about a cadenza. But then I expanded it. I said, well, it's going to be Elio and another man who gives him the thing. But it turns out that I was more interested in the relationship between Elio and Michel than about the cadenza. But I like the cadenza. And then I realized that the cadenza is a mystery, of course, because it's a piece of music that is composed by a man probably in the camps during the Holocaust, and he sends it to a person that he happens to love, or he's either a teacher who's in love with his students, or he's a good friend with a good friend. It's not made clear, and I didn't want to clarify it. But then I realized that this whole story of the piece of music has so many levels and tiers. You know, the father, the music teacher, the Jewish teacher who sends him a cadenza with Mozart, Beethoven, and then there's this Jewish prayer thrown in. I love anything that's kind of scaffolded that way because the relationship between Elio and Oliver, to say nothing of the relationship between Elio and Michel, is itself multi-tiered. It
yes.
is full of sort of past tense, pre-past tense,
Mhm.
conceived future. So the cadenza itself, though it started as an idea, it wouldn't have worked so well unless it fit as an idea into a plot that needed that idea.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think, many times I've read stories where I'm like, oh, the author wanted this more than the story needed it. And and it was sort of foist upon an otherwise unstable structure. But here it just felt like the cadenza like was an emergent property of the story. Like if someone had asked like which do you think came first, like the cadenza as an idea or like Elio and Michel's relationship and all that, I wouldn't have been able to tell you because it felt like one came as only as a result of the other. It felt really, and then there's like this whole other element where it starts to feel like fate, right? Like isn't it Elio? Is it Elio and Michelle, or is it Miranda and Sami who have that discussion about do they believe in fate? Like somewhere in the novel, there's a discussion of do you believe in fate? Is it real? And there's something about the cadenza which feels like this fated object that comes that comes about because these two people met on this particular rainy day in the cathedral on for the Sunday service. It feels like everything that happens after that happens only because these two people were fated to meet in some way. And of course, I mean, it's a novel, it's constructed, etc. Not to be too woo-woo about it, but it just, I guess part of what made it feel so alive is that it did have that sense of random happenstance that sort of grows and grows until these two people's meaning to one another is so huge that I'm like, oh, of course they met. They had to meet. How could it have been any other way that these two people came to be together?
Well, they do say something to that effect when they're having that dinner together, the first dinner, and they say, do, do you believe in fate? And it turns out that he believes in fate because they were going to meet. And that was a thing that was kind of awkward to say because they had no idea what that meeting means at the time. But they
Mm.
knew it was probably fated. I happen to believe that accidents happen in life. Uh, and there are people who say, oh, it was just a coincidence, blah, blah, blah. And that's the end of it. And there are people who say, no, the coincidence has to have meaning. And if it doesn't have to have meaning, I'll find a way to make it make meaning. I'll have to create some kind of thing to give it more scope than a stupid incident can have in life. And I think that's the job of any artist, writer, composer, whatever, is to take something that seems totally a fluke, sort of a lark, at the same time to make it become meaningful. And,
Mm.
and I think that's, for me, that's one of the things about Bach that I like the most, is that even that little ditty that he composes can acquire meaning if you know how to look for it. And it can come to represent your whole life too, personally. So this piece of music that Bach had no idea who Oliver is suddenly has meaning for Oliver.
Yeah. And is it Paul is the guy, is the name of the man, Paul and Erica, right?
Yes.
Isn't it Paul who says right before he plays that piece by Bach, he's like, this piece will change your life.
Yes.
And everyone in the room kind of like, oh haha, yeah, okay, musicians. But Oliver immediately is like, yeah, I know. I know all about the life altering
Well,
power.
when somebody plays a song for you as a gift to you, and it happens to be a song that he does not know has meaning for you because you heard it 20 years earlier, played by somebody you loved, you can't just say, oh, it's a coincidence. First of all, he's attracted to that guy.
Mhm.
Second of all, it's a younger guy, and he's thinking of another younger guy that he had met 20 years earlier. So the whole thing comes together, and I felt that maybe it's too much of an accident, and I didn't explain it well enough until I realized that James Joyce has the same thing in The Dead. Where basically when Greta sings a song, no, she hears somebody singing a song, and she tells her husband, there was a boy who was in love with me, and he fell sick because he stood outside my window one cold night and he died. And basically, suddenly, the story that seemed to be a stupid Christmas story explodes into becoming probably the best short story in the English language ever written. I don't know if you're with me on that or not, but
Yeah, I don't know if it's the best, but it's definitely, and I like there's something about a story like that. And I had this feeling reading the cadenza section of this book where it just felt like it was so full of that sort of the noise of human life, where it feels like, oh, of course, this feels like something apart from I'm just reading a piece of writing or I'm just reading a story, etc. The sort of constructedness of it falls away, and you feel like this piece is one human life talking to my human life, and you are in correspondence. And that's how I felt reading the cadenza section of Find Me, is like I felt like the sort of whole sort of constructed nature of the literature and the aesthetics and everything just fell away, and it felt like I was in correspondence with another human life, and it felt real to me, and it felt like of a piece with my own life, for my own, for a whole host of personal and whatever reasons. But it, I think that that's one of the things that great literature does, is like there's a moment in every, I think, great piece of art where the constructed nature of it falls away, and you are just in correspondence with something grander and bigger and deeper than, you know, your own petty
Well,
concern.
it's true. I mean, if you think about it, there are certain movies that you see, and as soon as you stop seeing them on TV, let's say, you forget you saw them. And then there are movies that you've seen that basically you wake up the next morning, the movie's still with you, and you wake up the next morning, the Sunday morning, and you say, "Oh my God, that movie has not disappeared. It's still with me," which is a fantastic feeling to have with any work of art. It's that it sort of belongs to you now, because it's as if it has sucked you into it, and you are now part of it, and it has given you a vision that you didn't have before. You don't know what that vision is, but you know there's something extra in your life, and there's a sense of gratitude, which it's what you do when you watch a painting by, when I watch a painting by Monet, you know, a good one, not the stupid ones, and there are plenty of stupid ones, but because I hate the haystacks, but okay.
Ah.
But I love the cathedral. And when you look at that, you say, this is, I understand what's going on, but I have no words for it.
Yeah, you know, I feel the same way when I look at Boudin. Like, there's something about, he knows something about the sky that just makes me feel like I've been touched in some deep,
Yeah.
ephemeral way. And, you know, I mean, I feel like, you know, all of your books, there are multiple moments where I feel that way. And to name a specific one, there's that line in the, like, the earliest pages of Call Me by Your Name, where Elio notices, I think it's either the inside of the arms or it's the heels slipping out of Oliver's sandals, and it's like unfledged, like the underside of a lizard, and it taught me things I never knew to ask. And then when that comes back and find me, I scream. I felt like, oh, Andre knew how much that line meant to me, and he put it in this new book. Like it. There's something about that line when it happens in Call Me by Your Name that just changed my whole conception of what literature could do. And then and no one else who I've talked to about the book has ever even noticed or cared about that line. And then it comes up in this book, and I was like, how did Andre know that I, particularly me in my own life, cared about that line enough to have them bring it back again? And so I mean, your books are full of that for me. The moment in Search of Blue, where you talk about wanting to keep the sight of the city and the town and the ocean like out of view until like you couldn't stand it anymore, you know, that sort of thing. But I do agree that there are moments in literature that lift us out of whatever blandness we exist in and set us out into the whole wide world. We have quite a few questions.
Oh,
Andre, we have so many questions, but I think we have a little bit more time. So I guess I wanted to ask, and maybe this can be our final question before we move on to Q&A. Um, I guess I wanted to ask, like, having written this book, having written Find Me, do you feel in some ways like, were there things in writing Find Me that you set out to do, things that you felt like you had sort of not landed the first time in Call Me by Your Name? Were there things that you wanted to make sure that you explored in this book that you didn't touch on in the first one? Or were there things that you understood better now that you feel that you didn't quite understand in the
mm.
first book?
Actually, no.
I
I
love
think
that.
the book is Call Me by Your Name felt very complete,
Mhm.
and I didn't want to borrow or sort of echo much of it. I figured there was the fact that you have the same characters, father, son, Oliver, was good enough. I didn't want to sort of check, but I had created a sequence of time slots. In other words, there's a 5 minute, 5 minute, 5 year later or 7 year later. There's a 10 year later, 15 years later, and 20 years later. That I had to respect because I didn't want to fault the time scale that I had established in Call Me by Your Name. However, and here my readers are perfect. There was one day a reader raises a question and says, you know, you've done this in such and such a way that if the year count is correct and you compare it to the older book, by the time the father meets Miranda, he should already be dead. And so I said, you know what? I never bothered to sort of to tabulate or to create a sequence of time so that it would be perfect. And I said, you were right. I made a mistake. I don't know how to do math. And that's the end of that. And readers have always come up with things that basically tell me more than I thought was there initially. And I'll give you a short example. You didn't ask it, but I'll answer.
I love
The
this.
one that is the most moving for me is when the father gives that speech to his son and says, you know, I could have had this, but I never did. But you should live your life the way you want to, and goes on and on and on. It's a beautiful speech, and I love it. Um, at some point, the son asks, "Does mom know?" And when I wrote it, it was more like, "Does mom know that I was sleeping with Oliver?" But the audience said, "No, that's not what it means. Does mom know that you could have been gay?" Is how we read this. And I
Mm.
said, you know what? That's a far better explanation than the one I had. So I said, yeah, we'll go with that. So I love when the audience gives me the kind of feedback that says, yeah, we're correcting you a bit. I don't mind.
Mm.
But we're giving it amplitude that it didn't have.
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much. You're just like, I mean, because the structure of the book, I mean, I did wonder when I heard that there would be a sequel, I was like, how is he gonna do that? Because the time, it's not like strictly chronological. Like he's got to like really do some Tetris to sort
Yeah.
of fit fit a sequel in there. So I have one more question. I just
Oh, sure.
remembered what the question that I have been dying to ask you for since I finished Find Me is there's so much dialogue in this book, Andre. You know, like a lot of like often when I think about your work, I'm like, ah, yes, the lyrical sentences, the language, memory, time, etc. But reading this book, it really made me realize, like André Aciman writes so much dialogue, and it feels so at once profound and also hilarious. How do you go about writing dialogue? Because I mean, there are writers who write in a sort of similar mode to you, who you know you're lucky if you get 5 lines of dialogue per 15 paragraphs or something like that. But your characters talk so beautifully and so profusively, and often like saying not what they want to say, but saying something to cover the thing that they really want to say, etc. How do you how do you approach dialogue, and what is it about letting characters talk to each other that seems to be so generative for you?
Well, initially, when I started writing, I was very influenced by Proust, of course.
Mm,
Everybody knows that. And basically, you have those long lyrical paragraphs where you sort of nick someone right in the moment that they're caught, and you've exposed them, and you move on to another moment that's actually elegiac, and so on and so forth. And then I find that as I'm aging, I find that dialogue is far more lyrical and at the same time reveals those hidden masks that we have, because don't only have one mask, we have many masks.
yes.
And I think that dialogue is a way of exposing that. I'm not always proud that I write so much dialogue, but I have a wonderful time writing dialogue. And I love the fact that characters speak. So, but then again, you said something that, of course, is so correct. A French movie has nothing but dialogue. They don't care about the wonderful landscape. They don't give you landscape. They don't give you the sky, the whatever it is, the beautiful sea. You get a glimpse of that, and then you have two people sitting face to face having those wonderful conversations, and or having a meal, and at the same time talking about the meal and talking about the fact that they're attracted to one another. And
Yes.
they shouldn't be saying that if you're attracted to somebody for the first time, but they say it. And the fact that they say it makes it so much more wonderful. And so there is something about France where dialogue is not just chit chat, it's also an exposition of what is actually going under the table, to use a bad metaphor.
Yeah. And I find it really like with like writing action in scene or whatever, like there are ways that you can where you can kind of cheat and get credit for doing something even though you haven't done anything, and like sort of writing out exposition. But with dialogue, it's like this irrevocable act. Like there's no taking it back. Like there's no having a character just ignore that someone just said the worst possible thing at the worst possible moment. It's one of the few means of like direct confrontation in writing. And for that reason, I always feel so afraid of it, because you've got to really have characters respond to what they say to each other.
But
Um,
if I may interrupt you, you do that in your book. I mean, you have a lot of dialogue, but you have moments when he says, "What did you mean by that?" It's that moment when somebody basically says, "No, I'm not going to let you get off the hook on this. What did you mean?" Well, I wasn't going to say it, that sort of thing. And then they move on. But dialogue is, I find, it's not that I'm a playwright. I'll never be able to be a playwright. I'm not a screenwriter. I don't know that craft. But when it comes to writing, I think that dialogue is extremely important.
yeah, oh yeah, I think it's one of the most important parts, but it's a part that I feel a lot of trepidation about.
Yeah.
And I guess like this conversation makes me think of, like often when I talk about your work with other people, and I talk about your work all the time, like you are never far from my mind when I'm talking about writing. But, people I feel sometimes misunderstand your work. Like they often are like, oh yes, André Aciman, he's so like elusive and he's so allusive and things get eluded. And I'm like, well, I think that he's like a really direct writer though. Like his characters are always confronting each other and like the biggest, most scary questions about life. Like I find that there's something so direct in your work, and you're always kind of teasing out the ripples of what comes following like a direct confrontation. And so I guess maybe my last question for you is, what role do you find confrontation playing in your work, and when you're sort of approaching writing characters, either in conversation or in scene or whatever? Like what is so important about confrontation that again you find it so generative?
It's because I think that there's a moment in Call Me By Your Name. I'll talk about Call Me By Your Name for a second. When the two characters, when Elio basically inadvertently, without meaning to, basically opens up and
Mm.
essentially confesses that he's very attracted to Oliver, but he doesn't say anything that would suggest that this is exactly what he's saying. Because if the other person didn't have at least a glimmer of understanding, he wouldn't understand what he's talking about. He would say, "Oh yeah, 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 certain things I know nothing about those things." "Oh yeah, you don't. Well, you're young, you wouldn't know, but you surprise me because you know so much." "Well, there are certain things I know nothing about, the things that really count." "Oh, like what?" "Oh, well, I don't know." You can ignore it, or you can go over it and elide it. And I like the fact that all confrontations, and when you think in our lives, when we have had to tell someone that we were very attracted to them, this is before the first kiss,
Mm.
before the first touch, before you do anything, when you actually say it instead of just showing it. Sometimes saying it is these are very difficult moments. And in fact, the most difficult scene in Call Me By Your Name was exactly that scene when Elio tells Oliver in 2 pages, basically, that he's attracted to him without saying a word about it. Whereas the speech of the father, which is so lyrical and so on, was written in a few minutes. It's the one that gave me a lot of trouble was that particular confrontation. So I think confrontations are difficult between human beings. And that's why I love a character like Miranda, who basically doesn't bullshit.
Oh,
She just goes for the jugular. And I love women like that, who basically says, "Look, I'm attracted to you. Are you going to do anything about it? Or are you just going to pretend you didn't know?" Well, what do you do with that? I love people who do that because I'm not always capable of doing it. In
mm.
my whole life, I've been very so timid and elusive and so on, but I've always appreciated somebody who says, "Let's put our money down on the table and see what's happening here."
Oh
Oh,
yeah.
oh,
Miranda.
you've known all along. Yes, I've known all along. What do you think? I'm stupid. That sort of thing. And you feel terrorized, but at the same time, it's the most magnificent moment in life.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. I could ask you a million follow-ups, but like let's let the chat have some say. Um, why was the separation of the two characters necessary for the solidification of their love. I guess they're talking about Elio and Oliver. And I guess we talked about that a little bit earlier, right? The sort of when two characters are separated, it's never forever.
Oh, uh, what is the question? I can't find it. I
Yeah.
don't know how to do this.
So I will be your
Okay.
yeah. So why was the separation of the two characters necessary for the solidification of their love?
So I think that their love was already solidified 20 years earlier. There's something very, we only fall in love, I think, maybe twice in our lives, but
Mm.
usually once. And usually it's the one that never works out. And it reverberates throughout the rest of our lives. It can happen very late in life. Usually it happens very early in life. Actually, both times it's the wrong time. And so that particular love, I think, never leaves them and it stays with them. They know that they don't want to deal with it because it's not a good thing. But Oliver does say that he celebrates the birthday of Elio every year in one way or another. That thing he's going to do, but he's not going to try to think of him for the rest. So the love was solidified. Um, I don't want to give a spoiler, but if I have to, I would say that it was unfinished business. And it was unfinished because it still was growing. It wasn't dying, it never died. It's still sort of there and it needs to be picked up again. And they know that. At least it is a recognition that both of them have to make.
Oh my gosh. And plus that sort of hidden optimism, right? That's at the heart of all your work, the return, the sort of hopefulness of the
Right.
return. But yeah, unfinished business, real, I mean, one of the most relatable aspects of the book. Oh, this is for me. What are some ways in which Aciman's Call Me by Your Name inspired real life? I mean, when I gave your book to a friend of mine after they'd read my novel, and they read Call Me by Your Name, and they're like, wow, Brandon, did you leave anything for André Aciman? You just stole everything from him. Um, Andre's influence is all over that book. I mean, the sentences themselves, my whole prose style comes from a very early and intense exposure to Call Me by Your Name and also to your essay collection, False Papers. Yeah, it would be impossible for me to point to one specific thing because the truth is the whole thing. Just
But I can point to one.
oh,
It's a moment in which Wallace notices the thigh muscle. I
mm,
forget of whose is it? Was it
Miller, I think.
Miller? Okay, he notices it. Nothing has happened yet, but he's noticed his thigh, and it's registered, and he knows that he's being looked at, and he doesn't say anything, and Miller doesn't say anything, and the reader saying, I know, but are you going to take me there or not? So, and I felt, oh, I know, it's the ankle, or it's the, what is it, the heel,
The heel.
the heel that looks like a chin. I can see that, but that's wonderful. I mean, I enjoyed watching this.
Oh my gosh. Listen, that makes me. I'm going to just read the next question before I start sobbing. That so well spotted, perfectly spotted, Andre. Absolutely, I was thinking of you. And also, every time I describe a pine tree, I think about the way that you write about pine trees and blackbirds. I think in some parts of Call Me by Your Name and in some of your other essays, you talk about sort of the Mediterranean pine, and it's haunted me my entire life. But yes, the thighs. I always think about the way that you write about the body, the flashes, the ways that our bodies give us away. Also writing very interior characters. I learned that from you. Question for both of us. Parents in both of your books are entirely central to the development of both of your main characters in much different ways. While writing your main characters, are you mindful of parenting and its impact on them? Are these queer characters reckoning with their upbringings or actively living in result of those upbringings? Andre?
Um, I think I had a father very much like the father in Call Me by Your Name. So very open, very, very frank, to a point where he may have been too frank about his experiences. But I never faulted him for that, and I never minded. I loved it because it always came with wonderful advice. And one of the advice, and I've quoted this many, many times, is told me once. He says, "Once your clothes are off, no matter who you're with, you can do anything you want. There's nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, don't hurt the other person, okay?
Mm,
But basically, it was told me that once you're naked, leave all your inhibitions behind the door. Do anything; it's fine." And
mm,
that when you're told that at a very young age, you're basically it beats every self-help book about sexual positions, what to do with your partner, how to get your partner aroused. It's meaningless
mm.
because fundamentally the one thing that you wanted to master was your inhibitions, and we have them. They're with us all the time. So, but my father was also a person who was difficult to live with, and plus, but he's influenced me, and he had fantastic taste in literature. And I think I'm a very good father, and I try to give my sons this sense that sexuality is whatever kind you want, as
Mm.
long as it's not with an animal. Okay, uh, it's all fine. There's nothing, no problem. And I think that they've taken that and moved on with it. So they talk to me about it sometimes, and I'm very grateful that they feel comfortable talking about it the way I was with my father. I was also the same way with my mother. I mean, sexual problems that I had or that I encountered in life with other people, I could discuss them, and there was never a sense of, oh my God, you're being not too, this is too private. It never happened.
Yeah, I mean, I also grew up in a family where like no one really talked about their feelings, but there was a great deal of frankness about like sex and the body. Like that was just it's a very strange way to grow up. When I'm writing, I don't know if I'm thinking about parenting, but I am thinking about the ways that like I am thinking about a character's family and where they come from because it does have such a huge impact on how you move through the world and how you feel and how you perceive and like what you think about yourself and what you think about others and so that is something that I think a lot about even if a character's family doesn't show up on the page directly. I'm thinking about their impact on the character and stuff. And people often ask me, like, Brandon, why are the families in your books so violent and dangerous and difficult? And I'm just like, I don't know how to write any other kind of family. I had a very difficult, messy, loud, huge Southern family, and so I'm just trying to draw on things that I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know how to write a character who came from a family that was like perfect. Like I don't think that that's conducive to like an interesting narrative maybe.
Actually, you wouldn't be able to write about a family where everybody's stoical and placid and calm and sort of encouraging and no hostility. I think that fundamentally, I think we both agree, a family is essentially a dysfunctional unit.
Mhm. It's every family is dysfunctional. I think that every family is dysfunctional if there's a writer in it anyway.
No, they're all dysfunctional. I think I've never known one that was functional. Um,
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it always your friends' families always seem sometimes they can seem functional until you hang around long enough.
until you ask them, and they'll say, "No, they're crazy," and so on.
Yeah, everyone's got an axe to grind, I think, if you look closely enough. Um, find me in real life. Does the emotion of yearning play a role? Do you think yearning as an identifiable mark of queer narrative should be celebrated or critiqued? Hmm. I mean, I guess for myself, I write about yearning because as an 18-year-old, I read Call Me by Your Name and it was full of yearning. And so I just presume that every there's something about there's something about I don't know if I'm writing queer narratives as like an extension of yearning so much as I think that the fundamental human condition is one of exile, which is something I learned from false papers. And so there's always a part of you that wants to be elsewhere and wants to be thinking, be with other people. And so yearning is like very integral to my work because it's maybe the primary emotion I live my life with. And so like that's what I like that's why my work is full of yearning is not necessarily an extension of queerness so much as like that is just how I perceive human reality.
I agree. I totally agree. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I write about, I mean, as a part of queer narratives, I mean, I think that I don't think that I don't think that it should be critiqued as a part of queer narratives because it's a part of life, and like we shouldn't place these expectations of like what a certain kind of literature should do just because we want parades and happiness. Like we should celebrate all aspects and valences of life. And I think it makes art less interesting if you say what queer narratives can and cannot do. That's just like less interesting, I think.
Oh my God, that would be terrible.
Can you imagine what would Proust be without yearning? There
It
would
would
be
be a
no
page.
Proust.
You would not have a single page.
Like the very first, you know, like I used to go to bed very early. Like it just like that's a statement full of yearning. Like it just yeah, you wouldn't have it. I mean, not just queer narratives, like you wouldn't have Camus either, or Sartre or Zola, like none of it would exist. No Flaubert, that's for sure. Here we go. So much of the charge in Elio and Oliver's relationship are fueled by a recognition of the self and the other. Is this quality indicative of a kind of agapic desire, or do you view this relationship as strictly romantic?
Oh God.
Mm.
I think that what happens when we are totally at home with someone else, then we feel that something called intimacy has happened. And you can have relationships, long lasting relationships, where there is really no intimacy. There's friendship, there's affection, but there's no intimacy. And intimacy is basically feeling that whatever you say or whatever you've done that you regret having done, you can confide in the other person without any shame or any reservation, without fear of criticism. In other words, if you've done something bad in business, um, you want to say, I made a mistake. And that's fine. We all do that. But sometimes you say something that, I was truly embarrassed by what happened to me that day. And that's something that you may never have told anyone except the one person that you feel intimate with. And you hope that this one person is, in fact, the person that you are living with. Um, because otherwise, people talk to their dogs too, and God knows what they tell their dogs. I mean, think of it. You have a shrink, and you tell your shrink things that you would tell nobody else. Well, that's not good. Okay, you want to be able to open up to somebody so that you and me, especially when we're in bed together, we're the same person. And I'll give you my name and you'll give me your name. And that is going to fuse our identities. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And as I said, intimacy happens very seldom in life. But
Yeah.
when it does happen, don't lose it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the first time I read Call Me by Your Name, I was like a very lonely, anxious 18-year-old. And I was like, no, I just want to get to the parts that feel like the parts that are most like my own life. And I was just like sort of skipping past all of that sort of like fusing of beings and selves. But every time I've reread the book, you know, over the last, I guess like over 10 years now, every time I've come back to the book, those are the parts that resonate the most with me now, is like the part, like the feverish anxiety of being like a young person in love and finding yourself, etc. Like all of that is important, yes, but the part that I think about most now is like it is really incredibly rare to find the one person who gives you yourself back to you in some new way, and the person who you give them their selves back to, and what used to feel like, I'm like, oh, here's all that philosophical stuff again, I don't understand it, and now I'm just like, oh yeah, the sort of bitter truth of the bitter truth of life.
Remember, I quote that line from Wuthering Heights because it hit me when I first read it. When I read it the last time, it was, so and so is more me than I am myself. Now, how many people have you met in your life who are more you than you are yourself? And as I always say, do not lose that person,
Yeah.
because that relationship may never happen again.
I mean, and it, I think that when you're young, you think, oh, I'm gonna fall in love a million times and I'm gonna, I'm gonna da da, it's gonna be great. But I think that part of coming of age or getting older is realizing like, oh, you were given it only once. Like you get one chance, and not everybody finds their other half. Not everybody finds that person who is
Yeah.
more you than yourself. And and that, I think, part of is what gives this story and so much of life that sort of melancholic contour is like, oh, we are promised absolutely nothing. Like there are no guarantees that you will find intimacy. Yeah, it's devastating. But so worth it when you find that person who is more you than you. I
Totally
mean,
agree. Totally agree.
harrowing to try to find them. Well, I think we've answered all of the questions, and I think we're at 4. So, Andre, this has been a life-changing conversation. Thank you so much for letting me talk to you about your book.
Brandon, this is, I mean, we've corresponded quite a bit. So this was a moment that was long in the coming, but I'm happy it happened. And once this clears out, and if you happen to be in New York, please, we should meet. And it would be lovely to talk more and more.
And more, and more, yes.
Thank you so much. Oh,
Connor's back.
I am back. I just want to say thank you to both of you. I think Brandon will manage to find his way to New York now, regardless of the pandemic.
If this pandemic lifts.
Yeah. Gentlemen, if I could ask you, I know there was a lot of talk in the chat that you didn't get to see, but Andre, many people remarked on how touching it was to them that you read Brandon's book, and I know you have it there with you.
yes.
Would you mind showing us? Andre told me he brought Brandon's book to today's event, but he didn't bring his own.
I forgot to bring my own.
And I think, Brandon, the audience would get a real kick out of seeing your copy of Find Me, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah, that's some tabs. That's some law school level tabbing right there.
There we go.
There we go. The whole stack, complete set. We'll work on getting those signed for you someday. And also, Brandon and Andre, I wanted to let you know, I took 2 polls of the audience while you were speaking, and 73% of the people who responded to the poll said they've never called their old phone number, though I wonder if that has changed or will change in the immediate aftermath of this event. And 91% of the people who responded said that they do not have life figured out. But we did have some people who said, yes, I do have life figured out. So I just wanted to, totally rigorous science for you, Brandon. But we did some polling. So thank you to everyone at home. We'll be back in half an hour with Kelly Jo Ford, whose book Crooked Hallelujah just came out, talking to Lucy Tan, who is a former UW Writing Fellow. And then we have Brian Greene and Jana Levine at 7 o'clock, and we'll end the day with Terry Tempest Williams for her new book Erosion at 8:30. Yeah, you can come back, Andre. You can watch. Thank you so much to everyone who was here today. So many excited people, and thank you, Andre and Brandon, for a truly unforgettable evening.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. I'm very grateful that this has finally happened. Okay.
Good.
Until the next time. Okay.
Until the next time. Bye.
Take good care. Brandon, thank you again.